So good morning and welcome to the Big Ideas in Supply Chain podcast. My name's Matthew Spooner. I'm a thought leader with Kinaxis, and today I'm speaking to Richard Markoff. Richard is a supply chain researcher, consultant, coach and lecturer. He's worked in supply chain for L'Oreal for 22 years in Canada, the US and France, spanning the entire value chain, from manufacturing to customer collaboration. He's also the co-founder and operating partner of venture capital firm Innovabot. Now, I've known Richard for 7 or 8 years, and we first met when Richard was doing research for his PhD in supply chain management. Over those last 8 years, Richard has come on a long way. He's moved from taking a sabbatical, a 2-year sabbatical, which seems to have gone on a little longer than he planned from his previous employer in L'Oreal. And he has now become one of the leading thought leaders in supply chain management in Europe. He lectures at universities in IMD, and in France, and Richard and I have had an ongoing collaboration for the last 7 or 8 years. So welcome, Richard.
Welcome, Matthew. Thank you for having me.
So recently, you've published some very interesting research that you've done in conjunction with Ralph Seifert in IMD around the impact and the changes around inventory management. And one of the really interesting observations you made was that economic growth is being driven by inventory build. Do you believe that this is actually a risk and will increase the risk of recessions as companies inevitably unwind those inventory positions?
So yes, you're right, Matthew. There was a time just a few months ago where in the US particularly, the GDP numbers were very aggressive. They were very promising. And all of the economic analysis was around the fact that inventory positions were growing. So the economic activity wasn't necessarily in making products, in manufacturing activity for products that were selling. It was for making products that were going to sit in warehouses. Right? So this isn't sustainable. This kind of made people worry. And for supply chain observers like us, we know what that kind of looks like. It starts to look like a bullwhip, right? Where we say, well, in a period about a year ago, spending was shifting from services to goods, and there wasn't nearly enough goods. So manufacturing really took off to try and fill that gap. And companies were getting scared, and they were saying, well, I'm going to order even more, and I'm going to have more safety stock, and I'm going to do shortage gaming, and I'm going to ask for more than I need so that I make sure I get at least what I need. And that the result of that was this big stock position a few months ago. And for those of us that watched, we said, well, this looks like a bullwhip. This looks like too much inventory, and there's going to be some kind of reaction against it. And so here we are, as you said, here we are now. We're starting to see the opposite story. Walmart and Target prominently are holding liquidations. They're trying to get rid of all this extra inventory that they have. And they're making statements on their financial calls with analysts about how this is eating into their margins. So they're saying, okay, look, our sales look okay, but it's because we're trying to clear out all this inventory and we're lowering the price of these, eating into our margins, and it's ruining our profitability. So we saw this coming a few months ago, and now here we are. And so it's a perfectly credible question to ask, well, is this now going to cause a recession? Because the idea would be is that manufacturing would now pull back, right, as a sort of the trough in the bullwhip, right, as it rebounds back and forth. So I would say, honestly, Matthew, I think that it's possible, but very difficult for us as observers to tease out. A lot of the manufacturing for the US doesn't occur in the US, it occurs in other countries. So if there's going to be a reduction in manufacturing activity, yes, it would happen a bit in the US, but it would also happen elsewhere. It's not as big a component as the economy in the US as, for example, consumer spending is. But my intuition is that, and I've never done research on this, this would be interesting to look at, that bullwhips sort of work like control loops, where you can have a big bullwhip in one direction, as we did to build up inventory, and the one that goes the other way to reduce the inventory will be a little bit smaller, and you'll continue to converge around a new demand level over time. Right? So if that's true, then the reaction of having too much inventory is going to be smaller than the reaction of having enough, and hopefully it won't cause a recession. In fact, the one time we did see this, Matthew, was coming out of a recession. Back in the great financial crisis around 2009 or so, there was a phenomenon called an inventory bounce. So I know you have an awful lot of experience in planning. Hopefully the listeners will follow along here. Is the idea is that if you're selling at a certain level and then activity goes down to a slightly lower level, your manufacturing activity actually has to go down much further than that to lower your target stocks to the new level, and then come back up again to the new lower level. And that coming back up is sometimes mistaken as an uptick in economic activity, and then can create a bullwhip effect, right? Not a big one, but nonetheless it can happen. And I wonder if that's the kind of thing that we'll see here.
Yeah, and actually I think that's really interesting, because certainly there are other thought leaders that I've been speaking to, like Laura Ciceri, who are really concerned that we don't take the bullwhip into account when we're planning supply chains. I mean, we've known about the bullwhip for many years, but I think that planners forget about these phenomenons. And I think in your recent article, you also made the point that it's not just inventory which are impacting the bullwhip. There's a lot of other factors in play at the moment. The increase in e-commerce, price speculation as a mechanism for dealing with inflation. All of these have potential to increase the bullwhip. So actually, when we're looking at planning, do you think that we actually don't factor in, or is it even feasible to factor in, the bullwhip in the planning decisions that we're making?
So you're right. There's more than one dynamic at play here. So the ones that you're citing are very important. There's the e-commerce effect. So I believe what you have in mind there is the fact that as e-commerce activity grows and the consumer continues to be very demanding of the service levels that they expect, this sort of mechanically means that we have to have inventory closer to the consumer so that they can get there closer. And if you do that, well, that means mechanically you have more warehousing, right? You have more warehouses for the same given demand, because it's moving from a sort of B2B, trade demand to an e-commerce demand. The overall demand isn't increasing, but the change in the mix means that you need more warehouses closer to the consumer. And that dynamic of having more warehouses brings into something called the square root rule, which is pretty empirical, but has nonetheless proven itself to be a law over time, which says that your inventory will increase for a given market and a given demand. If nothing else changes, if you have more warehouses, your inventory will increase by the square root of the new number of warehouses divided by the old. So if you went from 1 warehouse to 2, your inventory would increase by 43%, the square root of 2. Yeah. So that's a lot, right? And so this dynamic of creating these new warehouses and filling up this pipe and now maintaining this can create a bullwhip. You're absolutely right. And we're seeing this in increased warehousing costs. We're seeing this in increased saturation. Increasing safety stocks just by themselves can also create a bullwhip, because if you don't know what demand you're fulfilling, you might think there's an uptick, just like I was mentioning with the bounce, right? So instead of increasing production because demand has gone up, you're increasing production because you have a safety stock. It's hard to know that when you're several tiers down the chain. So to bring this to your question about the bullwhips, I think it's very difficult, if not impossible, to stop the bullwhip from company to company. We're just not that good at sharing and being transparent about information. Professor Seifert at IMD did some research a few years ago looking at publicly available information on balance sheets, and his conclusion was that in fact the bullwhip still strikes, that inventory does increase as you move up the chain. So you see it's one small increase and it moves forward. And even within one company, I think it's difficult to. You've looked at questions of supply chain governance just as I have. It's far from the consensus that there's an end-to-end governance in a supply chain and end-to-end transparency. So even if you had those conditions, it would be hard to prevent the bullwhip. But if you don't have them, it seems very difficult for me to imagine it. One interesting perspective to share on this that I think the listeners would enjoy, and even Kinaxis should keep in mind, is that as a professor, I teach the bullwhip many times in my classes. There's some great online tools where you can do this. And what I like to do is do a session where the students they go through the beer game exercise. I'm sure you're familiar with this, or variations of it, where you simulate the bullwhip. And then I have them do it again and do kind of a controlled experiment where I split the class in two. Half of them, I give them visibility into the downstream demand. So they know exactly what the increase in sales is that just earlier had triggered the bullwhip. We do it again, and now they see what it is, right? And for the other half, I don't give them the visibility, but what I do is I give them complete reactivity. So they can just react, right? They don't have any batch size constraint. They don't have any blocked horizons or lead time constraints. They can just produce whatever they want at any time, at least according to the planning buckets. And every time, conclusively, the supply chain that has more reactivity outperforms the supply chain that has more visibility. Because the visibility is just hard to grapple with, right? Now I see the demand, but what does that mean compared to my stocks? What does that mean compared to my order portfolio? There's so many questions around it that somehow it just seems to be easier to do everything you can to be able to build your supply chain to be able to react.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. I had a former boss who said something very similar to me, said that, if we had complete agility, if we had no lead time constraints and we could react immediately with 100% precision to events that were happening, we wouldn't need to plan. And actually I think that's really important, that it's not planning versus agility. Agility is actually really important. We need to focus on agility as well as excellence in planning, and the better we can become in agility, the less reliance we have to make on unreliable plans.
That's right. So since we don't live in that ideal world, we're always going to have to plan. Supply chain is about managing constraints. So if it's not going to be the constraint of your upstream suppliers and your components, it's going to be the constraints of labor or of machine capacity. There's going to be something you're going to need to plan. So we're never going to get rid of planning, but the more reactive you are, the sort of less pressure and stakes there are in that plan being exactly right.
So, and I think very much linked to that is that one of the big changes that I think has happened over the last 3 years is a change in the way that organizations need to think about planning. And so if I look at some of those organizations who've been in the Gartner top 25 for many years, who've developed some of the most efficient, most cost-effective supply chains, they've become brilliant at attacking bottlenecks, minimizing constraints, lowering inventory levels. I've certainly spoken to a few people who've made the comment that these organizations are potentially at risk because what was fit for purpose in terms of running efficient supply chains in the past may not necessarily be the right supply chain configuration going forward. Would you share that view as well?
I'm still dubious about it, Matthew. It's possible. But I'm not ready to say it's likely. But it's nonetheless a very good question. I mean, look, we've had this emerging common discussion theme in supply chain about resiliency, and it's okay to have this discussion about resiliency, but I find it somehow fundamentally unfair that it gets framed as supply chains are broken or supply chains are dysfunctional, functioning poorly. I really think what they mean to say is that supply chains were hyper efficient, right? Yep. They were completely optimized, right? So through a million different actions by different actors in different industries and in different companies, you end up with supply chains that don't have excess capacity in production. They don't have excess capacity in distribution. They don't have excess capacity in transportation. They don't have excess capacity in their dock infrastructure. Because if they did, it would be wasteful. Right? There's no supply chain anywhere that designs its capacity for the maximum use. It designs it for some compromise between cost and demand, right? If you go to get a coffee during your coffee break, you're going to wait in line, right? Because to design the coffee shop for when so that you have instant service when everybody takes their break wouldn't make sense. So I think given the cost imperatives that companies had to create global supply chains where they were chasing the most efficient labor costs, I think supply chains did an incredible job. And it somehow seems unfair to turn around now and say that they were broken or functioning poorly. So that being said, what does the future look like, right? Like what is the new paradigm? Are we moving to a world where it's not going just to be about hyper efficiency? Are we moving to a world where it's going to be more about resiliency and about business continuity? And that's where I reserve judgment. I'm skeptical. I think that most companies will largely pay lip service to this until such time as there is a tangible economic incentive for them to change the footprints of their supply chains. It's easy to talk about how we're going to nearshore, onshore, reshore our production, but there's a reason why that production was put overseas or went or started overseas. It was cheaper, and the risks were seen as black swans or difficult to quantify. So I don't know that because we've seen this just a series of events, not just the pandemic, but also there was the blocking of the Suez Canal, right? And then there was all the blockages in places like Long Beach that made all the news, and then the port of Shanghai for the new shutdowns in China. All of these sequences you would think would give you a lesson about resiliency, but I don't know. Gartner did a study about 6 months ago or so. I can't put quite a date on it, where they said that something like 30% of companies were interested in reshoring. They were interested in reshoring. But then when you dug into the article, every single one of those 30% said that they expected the increase in cost in manufacturing to be recouped by savings in supply chain, right? Which is a big ask, right? Because, okay, yes, you're going to save a little bit in transportation, perhaps, right? But and maybe a little bit in inventory, but that doesn't look like it's going to happen now. But basically, for me, what they're saying is it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen unless it's overall cheaper for the company. And if it was overall cheaper for the company, they'd already be doing it, or some of them would be doing it. Bloomberg came out with an article just a few weeks ago, or maybe 2 weeks ago, saying that something almost like 87% of companies that the C-suite on their investor calls are talking about onshoring, reshoring, and nearshoring, and perhaps they will. Also, I saw very recently that from 2020 to 2021, U.S. manufacturing saw an increase of 116%. So maybe that's a sign that it's actually happening. We have to look at numbers like that with a bit of a jaundiced eye. 2020 was a very weird year. It's not so hard to have increased manufacturing from 2020. Like a lot of things were down in 2020, right? That was the peak of the shutdowns. So all this to say is that I'm dubious, but Matthew, if I were still a supply chain practitioner, if I were still at L'Oreal, I would absolutely jump on this and try and get as much of the production of either my manufacturing, but more to the point, the components and raw materials that I use to manufacture, to get them as close to me as possible. Right? So that was the bottleneck in my supply chain, and for cost reasons, we often would go overseas, and I would leap at any opportunity to try and take advantage of a political climate that would allow me to get some of that sourcing as close as possible to me. That would lower my lead times and limit the bullet effects if we want to tie it to the earlier discussion. I'd be more reactive.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say as well, because I don't know if you saw in the news, but earlier this month, Peloton announced that they're actually moving production away from the US and outsourcing it to China. And what that tells me is that an organization who's in financial distress, such as Peloton, are not performing so well at the moment, that when the dollars are on the table, they're going with the lowest cost of they're going with the lowest cost of manufacturing.
There you go. So it's I think economists would call it their revealed preference, right? The behavior shows you what they really think. Now they could be wrong, right? So large companies have a very hard time truly understanding total cost of ownership. It's a difficult thing to work out. They're usually siloed into different P&Ls with different incentives, but they broadly go in the right direction, at least from a cost perspective, and cost of goods rules the day almost always, right? So your example, I think, is pretty illuminating.
Yeah. So and I think when we're looking at the way that we plan supply chains, one of the things that concerns me a little bit is that there's a lot of investment in digitization and advanced planning tools and other digital tools. And I feel that there's a risk that we're putting a lot of effort in creating faster systems which are treating the symptoms rather than actually addressing the root causes. And we're actually just processing the problems faster and faster. Whereas maybe what we should be looking at is taking a step back and saying, are the techniques that we're using in the supply chain management, are they fundamentally wrong in the first place?
I think that's a really good question, and you have a really good point. So supply chain managers are largely, not exclusively, but largely engineers. So engineers like to look at supply chain problems as math problems, as numbers problems, as tool problems. So there's a tendency to think if I have a better tool, my supply chain will run better. And I think there's truth to that at a baseline, right? So I think it's way better to have an advanced planning system that goes end to end than to not have an advanced planning system that goes end to end. But I think it kind of stops there. I think that you're quite right. I'm reminded of the conversations that I often have with startups. If I put on my venture capital hat for a moment, once you've built a minimum viable product, a product that's good enough for the market, you probably should really be changing your resource spend from R&D to sales. Because in all likelihood, if you continue to improve your product from there, you're now making a product that is too good for your consumers, right? That you could probably sell what you have, and you continue to R&D, continue to improve your product, continue to work on the next version, but don't make it necessarily the big priority. Go and sell what you have, right? So I feel it's kind of the same way with supply chain tools, is that I don't think that we need tools that are have more AI and more machine learning and more sophisticated algorithms. I just think we need to use the ones that we have with correct processes. And if we do that, we'll succeed. I mean, we can tie this to what we just said. If you want to have a good demand plan, you need to have a good S&OP process. A good S&OP process means that you're going to have alignment. That's the deliverable of S&OP. And to have alignment means you have to have sales on board, marketing on board, general management on board, finance on board. These are process questions, not tools questions. A tool might make it a little bit easier. You have reports that you can interact with that might be more credible, but it's not the blocking point, right? Having a basic tool to do your demand plan is going to be more than enough. And so it's certainly not going to be having some kind of fancy tool where you're asking your salesperson whose spreadsheet reads right to left, go and put data in and relying on that so that you have a good S&OP process. And if we're going to look at things from end to end, I think if we talk about what we had before, visibility is good, it's important, we want everybody on the same page. But if you want to have a supply chain that is really going to have good service at low inventory, you have to deal with those bottlenecks, you have to deal with those constraints. So just like my beer game experiments show, that's about building reactivity, lowering those bottlenecks. That's not a tool story, that's a management story, that's a negotiation story, that's business, that's making trade-offs, and it's not inherent in the tools. Another thing last point I guess I would make about this, Matthew, is let's think about the part of the supply chain planning world that many people forget, at the very sort of left end of it, which is shop floor scheduling, right? So detailed scheduling of your production equipment, maybe it's lines and vessels or these sorts of things. There are plenty of tools out there, and have been around for a long time, that will offer optimization tools. right? I don't want to pick on APO, but APO and their APO dollars have been around for a long time, at least since 2005, right? Probably before that's when I became aware of them. And what many companies have found, including very big, serious consumer goods companies that are often at the forefront of these things, they've looked at these tools to automate their shop floor scheduling, and they said the work that it would take to put in all of the data and all the parameters so that the machine learning and the algorithms can calculate the trade-offs properly, still yielding a result that I have to work by hand, is just not worth it. I'm better off having a planner do the plan, the shop floor scheduling with all the constraints of labor capacity, component availability, raw material availability, quality, lead times, all the things that go into it. I'm better off planning that by hand than by using these tools. So I take that as saying, look, like what you have is already more than your customers are using. At some point, yes, perhaps you're going to come up with something that is good enough that'll replace it, but right now that's not what they're asking for, right? You're already going beyond your tools. Your tools are not fit for purpose for what's going on now. So I don't think that that's where the key lies in going forward. I don't think we need the faster tools. I don't think that companies are ready for that kind of automation. They've shown it, but by their revealed preference. I think that supply chain managers should be working on reactivity and bottlenecks. These are the things that they're paid for. This is where their added value is.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that the collaboration between different functions is far more important than putting in place of advanced digital tools, AI and machine learning, and I think and we've talked about this probably for the last 8 years or so, 8 years around collaboration between different functions within the supply chain, and I believe that your research actually demonstrates quite conclusively that organizations who are better aligned and better able to collaborate have better financial performance.
That's right.
And maybe I think we're seeing even stronger evidence of that today than we were seeing 8 years ago. Would you tend to agree with that with what you're observing?
I do agree with that. Companies that push for an alignment between the sales plan and the financial plan and the demand plan, and then alignment between the production plan and the supply that you need. These are companies that have plans that are less manipulated, that have information that is more shared between all of the different actors. So especially now with everything that has happened, the more fluid and frictionless the exchange of information between the supply chain and the business actors about what's happening in the trade, what's happening with promotions, what's happening with inventory, what can we do with our catalog right now, especially during COVID. These were the companies that sort of won COVID, if you will. Right, we can look at Skew rationalization and simplification as an example of this. There are companies who reacted right at the depths of COVID by saying, what we're going to do is we're going to vastly simplify our product offer. Right, Berea, the pasta company, I think I might be exaggerating a little bit, but I think that they went down to like 6 or 7 pasta SKUs. And they said, we're just going to fill the shelves with these. These are our A+ SKUs. All of the packaging components we're going to get, we're going to have the art that's going to be decorated for these. With the people that we can manage to get into our factories that aren't sick, this is what they're going to make. We're going to fill their shelves with this. And everybody was happy. They wanted pasta, and then Berea was able to get it to them. Unilever did the same thing with Marmite, I believe, which is something I've never tried, but I gather that is an acquired taste, and they were successful at it. Another company who asked me not to name them, their European head of marketing, they did the same sort of thing, a consumer goods company, and he said, I knew my supply chain was good, but I'd had no idea just how much of a strategic opportunity and advantage they were for us. So these companies that are able to do this are companies that had a good S&OP process, that were aligning, sharing information, and they turned COVID into financial success. Now, I imagine, like me, you probably spent a lot of time in your career making all manner of spreadsheets, trying to make justifications for simplifying catalogs and rationalizing SKUs, because for some reason companies seem to think that this is a supply chain responsibility when it really isn't. And now here we have a real life case where we could perhaps not quantify the unquantifiable, because simplifying your catalog is not something that is quantifiable, but at least you can point to and say there's a cost to complexity, and we're paying for it, and if we simplify, then we can recoup some of those costs, even if we can't fully measure them.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And do you actually see, though, any of these organizations who rationalize their SKUs? Do you believe that anyone is actually maintaining a rationalization of SKUs, or is it going back to the marketing organization and they're rapidly putting those SKUs back on the shelf?
What a great question. I should go back and ask some of them what they're doing. I do have one anecdote of a company that had a real SKU rationalization problem that has not gone back to the old way of doing things. But that would be interesting to look at. I should, even if it's not particularly scientific, I should sort of give people a call and find out. The last sort of opportunity we had to study this was, again, in the Great Recession, where Walmart announced that they were simplifying their catalog so that they could make better use of the space in the stores and their working capital when money and cash were tight. And about 18 months later, they announced that they were going to go right back to having more SKUs on the shelves and back to the old SKU count. So I guess their experiment was that they did not deem it a success back in the day. I'd like to go back and ask some of these people what they've done. That's a really good question, to see if anybody's learned anything at all from this.
So with all these dynamics that are going on in the supply chain, with potentially inventory increasing and the bullwhip effect, but maybe questions over SKU counts, if you were still in L'Oreal today, would you be looking at trying to secure more warehousing space based on the constraints that we're seeing on warehousing, or what would your thought processes be at the moment?
I would absolutely be looking at securing commitments. There's been a trend, this is specific at least to consumer goods that I know of, over the past 10 years to really move warehousing to third-party logistics providers to go outside. So that means you do lose some control, right? And it means that your costs can spike on you when there's a shortage of space. A few months ago, when we saw those GDP numbers in the US, I looked at the saturation rates of warehousing in the eastern seaboard of the US, and we're at 96%. Now, like we talked about, a lot of that was due to overproduction, bullwhip, shortage gaming, that sort of thing. But not all of it. A lot of it is e-commerce activity and that sort of thing. So there are underlying structural dynamics that are going to continue the need for more warehousing. And what I have noticed is I've met other venture capital firms and private equity firms that are now actually focusing as their investment thesis to buy up distribution properties, to refurbish them, to make them sort of up to snuff in what we understand about safety, fire safety, and storage and construction requirements, because sometimes some of them, they need work, and then either flipping them or leasing them out to third-party logistics providers or other companies, and it's working out really nicely. There are even publicly available vehicles now for people to invest in warehousing. So the market is speaking, that it is seeing that there's an opportunity here, that they expect prices to go up. We see as planners that there's no reason to think that's not going to continue. So yes, I do think that I would want to secure space. In fact, I looked very recently at an industry report which said that in 2021, logistics real estate prices were at an all-time high. That kind of makes sense on one level because of inflation, which is kind of natural that prices continue to be on all-time high, but that doesn't have to be true year to year. And it was the case, and I'm sure when 2022, when the dust settles, it'll be the same thing.
And so I've just got one final question for you. So if you could run for the chief supply chain officer of the world, what would be your #1 campaign initiative?
Oh boy, I have to limit myself to one.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll give you, I guess, a very sort of boring, pedantic answer to that. Since I feel if I were to be supply chain king of the world for a day, what I would want to do, since I believe that we need reactivity. Reactivity is based on information sharing. Reactivity is based on everybody being on the same page about no ambiguity. If I could be supply chain king for a day, I would want to have and impose a universal standard of codes, of data, of information, and of terms, so that when companies wanted to work together and to collaborate together, all of those obstacles are gone. Right? And we can kind of lower the water in the lake and say, all right, let's work together. Let's share stock. Let's share demands. Let's go all the way up and down the chain and try and remove these bottlenecks and collaborate together. And there's already enough obstacles against that because each company has its own financial incentives, its own P&Ls, its own agendas. It's already hard enough to get collaboration between actors in the supply chain. You and I know this, but many people who are looking from the outside, they don't realize these are different companies, each trying to optimize their profits. And it's already hard enough in that context to make a supply chain that holds water. But then when you get bogged down in questions of, well, no, this is how I code this, or this is how I manage this data, and my system needs this, it becomes sort of this impossible rock to push up a hill. So I would want to just sort of make one kind of data platform and data dictionary and language that all supply chain people could speak. After all, data is the language that we work with together. It's the universal language of supply chain people, and yet somehow we still speak to each other in tongues. So that would be what I would do if I were for a day. I could probably think of a few more if you gave me a few more.
I think that's a really worthy answer. Actually, I think that's an excellent response. So, Richard, well, thank you very much for spending some time to talk to me today. I think, really interesting conversation, and I look forward to having a few more conversations with you on, and going maybe a little bit deeper into some of these topics that we touched on today, because I think that there's some really interesting topics that we're covering. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Matthew. It was a pleasure.